we're looking at chaos, political chaos, economic chaos, the potential for a financial meltdown, because the whole world is built upon a foundation of debt.
It really hardly feels like a Depression-era lifestyle for many, but there are some less fortunate people, and inflation has widened this gap between the haves and the have-nots. So what are your thoughts, especially when it comes to housing and the fact that you're getting more today, but not everyone is?
Because of advances in technology, number one, and number two, the fact that the average person is wired to produce more than he consumes and save the difference. Of course, we have more today than we did 100 years ago. That goes without saying, but it doesn't seem that way, because even though workers are more productive than they were in the past, everything is financed with debt today. And people talk about inflation as if it's just part of the cosmic firmament. It just happens. It doesn't happen. The government is the sole and entire cause of inflation. It does it by printing up money directly and indirectly. And what that does is it destroys the capital that you save. Americans save in dollars. Okay, you want to get ahead? You produce more than you consume and you save the difference in dollars. But when the government destroys those dollars through inflation, your standard of living goes down. Now, that's been disguised through debt. It used to be that when you bought a house, you paid cash for it. Then, many years ago, it started out with a 5-year mortgage with 20% down. Now, we're talking about 30-year mortgages, so that you really never own your home. Inflation is the real problem. It destroys capital. It destroys people's standard of living. The standard of living, generally speaking, in the U.S. is going down. It's disguised by the fact that when you borrow money, you're either taking capital that people have saved in the past and you're using it for consumer goods now, or you're mortgaging your future for a higher standard of living today. But all the debt we have in the U.S., I think, is unsustainable. And we could have either a credit collapse if they don't create money fast enough, or if they raise interest rates too high, or we could have something resembling a hyperinflation like we have down here in Argentina. Either way, it's going to be very, very bad news, because in an advanced industrial society like the U.S., to poison the money supply with inflation is asking for economic catastrophe. So I think what we're looking at over the next 10 years, and this is true for a number of reasons, not least of them, is the fact that Americans have elected in Washington people that are the equivalent of Jacobins during the French Revolution. I mean, they have the same ideas. I'm looking for very, very tough times, quite frankly, not just in the U.S., but almost everywhere in the world.
Today in the United States, compared to 100 years ago, one spends more of their income on housing and transportation and healthcare and less on food and clothing. And yeah, Doug, to your point about inflation, like, dollars are such a poor measuring stick. That's why earlier when we look at the cost of housing, I tried to discard dollars by going ahead and looking at the ratio between the home price and the gold price. And I brought up the point last month with our audience that actually there's no such thing as grocery inflation or rent inflation. It's the government that creates the inflation. So it's not landlords or grocers that are creating inflation. Those higher prices are just a consequence of the inflation that the central bank creates. And that's creating this erosion of the middle class, because those in the lower middle class and the poor, they don't have assets that benefit from the inflation, yet they have the same fixed consumer costs that we're talking about here, like housing, transportation, healthcare, food, and clothing. So talk to us some more about the problem in the government and how that could help lead us toward a silent depression. I know you brought up the point that the U.S. government is running embedded deficits of $2 trillion per year, and that number is going to go much higher, if only because the interest cost alone is $1 trillion per year.
Yeah, people have to stop looking at the government as being their friend. It's not. It's a predator. It's a dead hand on top of society. It's certainly not a cornucopia, which is the way most people seem to see the government. The government will give them stuff.
Right.
The government will do stuff. No, it doesn't. The government produces absolutely nothing that it doesn't take away first from society as a whole. So people have to stop looking at the government as a friendly big brother. It's more like increasingly the kind of big brother that you might have discovered in George Orwell's 1984, and go back to the values, moral values, social values, type of thing that this country had 200 years ago when it was founded. I mean, that's my answer to the question. And the money, the dollar itself is a floating abstraction. It's a fiat currency. It's an IOU nothing on the part of a bankrupt government, which can't even tax enough to give the money value. It just prints up more money and people out of inertia accept them. Well, there's nothing else they can use to trade. Look, we should go back to gold as being money, not even a gold-backed currency. A currency is money. It's just a medium of exchange and a store of value. You don't need to insert the government and a central bank in between you and what you do with your fellow citizens in a country. That's why we should use gold, which for thousands of years has proven to be the best thing to use as money. It's one of 92 naturally occurring elements. And just as aluminum is particularly good for building airplanes and uranium is particularly good for making nuclear power plants, gold has unique characteristics that make it unique for use as money. So the government shouldn't be involved in this. That's something that most people have even thought about. They'll say, oh, this is completely ridiculous. This is off the wall. This is unrealistic. So yeah, we're looking at a nasty depression, and it's been building up for many years. This isn't a recent phenomenon that's come up just since Biden. This is a trend that's been building up slowly for decades.
With the government having all of that debt that I just mentioned, that would create the propensity for them to create even more dollars so they can pay back their own debt, which could create more inflation and just this perpetually vicious cycle. When you think about the profundity of some of these things, if our currency went onto a gold standard or a Bitcoin standard, the fact that the government would not even be involved in currency issuance anymore. Doug, I want to know where you see us headed, because a lot of people see today unemployment 4% in the United States. We have GDP growth that's decent. The rate of inflation is still higher than the Fed target, but it's come down substantially. The Fed's even talking rate cuts this year. So where do you see this all headed with the silent depression?
Well, first of all, it's a big mistake to trust the government's numbers. If you look at the way the government computed unemployment and the way it computed inflation back in 1980, it's very, very different from the way these numbers are computed today. And if you computed them the way they did way back when, in 1980, you'd find that our current unemployment is something more on the order of 10%. And current inflation is not 2%, 3%, 4%. It's also more like 10% or more. But with the amount of money that they've created, I mean, trillions of fiat dollars that have been cranked out of Washington in recent years, I expect we're going to see inflation go back to much, much higher levels. There's no limit to how bad it can get. And since the government has promised all these things to various pressure groups in the U.S., they have to be paid. Taxes aren't there to do it. Borrowing, they can't borrow anymore, especially as interest rates go up. And incidentally, I'd point out that because of the debasement of the currency, better phrase to use than inflation, debasement of the currency, it's an active thing that's done by the government and its central bank, whereas inflation, people think, well, maybe inflation is the fault of the butcher or the baker or the gasoline maker. No, it's not. Those people fight the effects of inflation. Inflation is something that comes out of Washington. So because the government has all these pressure groups that get all kinds of benefits, they're going to have to keep printing up money to pay for these things. And you're going to wind up in the same position as Argentina has wound up. In fact, it's going to be worse because unlike Argentina, which doesn't have any foreign involvements, they had a war with the Falklands 40 years ago, but there's basically no Argentine army. There's no Argentine navy to speak of. But the U.S. has 800 military bases scattered all over the world, very expensive to maintain. The natives aren't particularly happy to have foreign soldiers in their lands. And in addition to the war in the Ukraine, why we're involved in a border war between two countries is a mystery to me. And now we have Israel and Gaza dusting it up. Listen, I feel sorry for both sides. But on the other hand, I don't a pox on both our houses. It's not our problem. This has been going on between these people for 2,000 years. And the U.S. getting involved in it is going to add on to our ongoing bankruptcy. There's new wars popping up all over the world that are going to cost us huge amounts of money. It goes on and on. It's a big problem. So we're looking at chaos, political chaos, economic chaos, the potential for a financial meltdown because the whole world is built upon a foundation of debt, which is a very unstable foundation to build things on. And of course, you've got all kinds of sociological problems, starting with the total and absolute corruption of the U.S. educational system, which is spread like poison throughout society. We're seeing that now, incidentally, with the presidents of Harvard and Penn and MIT, but all higher educational institutions in the U.S. suffer from the same problem. This is like a many-headed hydra where we can take any one instance of a problem in society, and when we examine it, you find that's even worse than you might think. Like, for instance, I was talking about education. Your kids are being indoctrinated at great cost. And there are, I think it's the University of Michigan, has 161, I believe that's the number for the University of Michigan, DEI administrators. That's diversity, equity, and inclusion administrators, all earning over six figures. And what are they doing? Well, they're justifying their positions by doing absolutely ridiculous things in an education that should be about educating as opposed to enforcing somebody's goofy ideas of diversity and equity and inclusion. So anyway, we've got lots of problems beyond real estate and beyond the high level of rent that people have to pay today. Listen, it's so hard to build a new house, God forbid, build a new apartment building today. By the time you jump through all the hoops, local, county, state, federal, I mean, the cost of construction is probably twice what it should be because of regulations. I hate to be so gloomy, Keith, I do, but...
Well, there's a lot there. When we talk about diversity, we're in an era where people are very conscious of that, but a lot of people think of it with regard to race or gender or perhaps religion, but I like to champion diversity of thought as well. And then when it comes back to the root of productivity, I think that's really important because whether the government gives away money to programs in the United States or outside the United States to Ukraine or Israel, whether you believe in that or not, and a lot of the giveaways have been in the hundreds of billions of dollars to those nations. And my point is the United States doesn't produce as much as they used to. However, the United States produces a lot of dollars and a lot of debt. And when the government has giveaways, either domestically or internationally, a productive person is the one that has to end up paying for that. So, Doug, we think about a lot of the problems out here, much of it coming back to the root of inflation. Why don't you tell us more about what can be done? In fact, I know you have a practical common sense way where you don't save in dollars. You and I have talked before about how real estate or gold can give you a hedge or even help you profit against inflation. But you've talked about the importance of real material things like food that you can store or light bulbs that you can put away or tools that you can use because you're also not taxed on those sorts of things. So can you tell us more about that?
Well, there was a book written years ago, and it's still available on Amazon by an old friend of mine named John Pugsley. And the book's name was The Alpha Strategy. The point that John made in that book was that rather than trying to save in dollars, you should save in things that have a long shelf life that you're going to need and use. So for instance, if light bulbs, common thing, they burn out. If you wait until there's a sale on light bulbs, get them cheap, buy them in quantity, buy them extra cheap, put them aside. You're not going to have to buy a light bulb forever. Whereas if you don't plan ahead and do it that way, if your light bulb burns out, you don't have one, you got to get in your car, burn gasoline, buy it at the convenience store where it's going to cost you twice as much. I mean, and you can do this with many areas of your life, planning ahead. In other words, this is a variation, if you would, on the old Mormon idea. A lot of people are aware that Mormons, their religion tells them that they should put aside 3 months or a year worth of food, and it's stored food, which is properly canned and so forth, so that no matter what happens, they'll always be able to eat. Well, the alpha strategy is something that you take that attitude towards food and you apply it to all the consumable things that you have in life. And as they go up in price, light bulbs go up from $1 to $5 with inflation. If you made an investment that kept pace, $1 to $5, you'd have to pay capital gains tax on it, but you don't on the consumable that you put aside. So I mean, this is just one of a number of strategies that you can use to counter the effects of currency debasement.
Yeah, I love that as a strategy on what you can do. You are not taxed on the gain in price or value of an entire pallet of food or tools like a tractor or ladder or table saw. So it's a really elegant way to beat inflation. Doug, I have an idea, and it might not be one that you heard before. It might even make the listener laugh a little bit here. I have an elegant way to beat inflation and improve your quality of life at the same time. And it's something really simple. And that solution is to spend your money. It's an elegant way to beat inflation and improve your quality of life at the same time. If a Mediterranean cruise for you and your wife is going to cost $18,000 this year, and you think it's going to cost $22,000 next year, spend, beat inflation, and get an experience that you'll never forget. Now, as long as you've got something set aside already, spend. That's a way to beat it and live a better life.
I can't argue with that, Keith, but on the other hand, it's wise to put aside capital for the future, because once you consume that cruise, the capital is not there anymore, and you may need it in the future. But this is one of the problems created by currency debasement. People start thinking in terms of live for today, because tomorrow we might die with their money. And that's not a good way to get wealthy, although it's true, you do beat some of the effects of currency debasement that way.
Yeah, if there were no inflation, there would be less incentive to do something like that and spend. There'd also be less incentive to invest. But Doug, you've given us a lot of good ideas today for this creeping of the silent depression fueled by inflation and some actual things about what we can do about it. You can watch this one next.